So today we're going to talk about implementing a 360 program. There's some special considerations we need to think about as we go through the process to maximize its effectiveness. It's all coming up right now. Hi there, I'm Andrea Adams, and this is the HR Hub. On this show, you get expert insight into anything related to HR. I encourage you to subscribe to the show or the podcast. Keep learning from my guests. So today, my guest is Jo Ayoubi. Jo is the co-founder of Track 360 Feedback. She is a consultant in the UK who's been doing this kind of work for a long time with a wonderful depth of knowledge in the area. And she's also an expert on, rising out of that, an expert on all elements of 360s. Hi, Jo. How are you?
I'm great, Andrea. Thanks for inviting me on.
Well, thanks for coming back. Okay, so we're just going to dive in. There is so much to this, but when we step back, what are we trying to accomplish with a 360 program, especially when we're trying to do it well?
Ooh, okay, so we are with a 360 feedback program. What we want to do is gather data. At its simplest, we are finding information to give us insight into the things that are hard to measure in an organization. So we can measure productivity, we can measure sales numbers, we can measure budgets, but it's hard to measure what people are doing, how they're doing their work. And, in an environment where it's important to make sure that people have a good environment to work in. So the 360 is a way of measuring that, finding out what behaviours are happening in the workplace. Are they aligned? Are they what we want to see? What areas are working well? Where do we need to develop? So that's kind of at its heart, really. Mm-hmm. And so the things we need to do well are to define what those behaviours are for our organisation. And that can be based on our values, our competency frameworks for specific groups like leaders or managers. But that's really the heart of what needs to be right for the 360 to be effective.
That leads in perfectly to my next question. So how do we prepare for the implementation of a 360 process?
Well, that's a great question, because the preparation for a 360 is actually really, really important. So, because as we know, in HR, we know that if something doesn't work well, then it's not going to work long-term. People are not going to have faith in a particular process. So what's important is defining the purpose. Why are we doing this? Sometimes I get, somebody comes to me and says, we want to do a 360. And I say, well, okay, what is it you want to do? Why? What do you want to achieve by it? So I think the first thing is, what's the purpose? That's the most important thing. And there's got to be agreement from the key stakeholders around what it's for, what it's going to measure. So what is it for? And therefore, what behaviours, what skills are we going to actually be assessing here? Who are the people that are going to be involved? And actually, with a 360, it's usually most people in the organisation. So preparation around people who are giving feedback as well as people who are going to receive it. So preparing all those people for what it's going to be. What's it going to look like? What's the feedback look like when it comes to me? Is it going to say, Jo, you're doing a terrible job? No, it's not. It's important for me to know that. What's it going to be used for? Is it going to be used for my performance review? Oh, because if you don't tell people, they're going to think the worst, because that's the way we are. So they're going to think, what's it for?
Can I jump in here?
Yeah.
Is it not the performance review?
Okay. It's an important part of the performance review, but it is not the performance review. I think it's one thing we would not recommend is using 360 as the performance review tool for good reasons. Because it's anonymous, if you then give someone a performance rating based on anonymous feedback, they could challenge that. So the 360 is an excellent tool for supporting the development discussion of performance. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I would not rely on it exclusively for the actual performance review.
Can you tell us, in your own mind, what is the difference between a 360 and a performance review?
Yeah. A performance review would be, in terms of what it measures, it may very well measure similar things. So it might say, what did I achieve? What did you achieve in the last 6 months or in the last year? But performance review, by its nature, leads to a performance rating, normally.
Yeah.
Potentially, it could affect promotion. It could affect salary. It could affect bonus. And that's why I would not rely on it for that process. What I would do is I would use it as one of the elements of the performance review. Okay. So it may very well be that performance review, the discussion is about how well I'm delegating to my team. And guess what? My 360 backs that up. The 360 shows that is the case, and that's something I need to do differently. So it's a little bit subtle, but I wouldn't recommend using the 360 itself as the performance review tool for those reasons that I mentioned.
Okay. The steps of implementing a 360, what are they? Like when you go in with a new client, what are they?
So the first thing is for implementing is to define what it is that they want to use the 360 for.
Okay.
And then we would then talk about who the key stakeholders are going to be. So who are the group that are going to be going through the process? Who are the people who are going to be giving them feedback? Who else is involved? Line managers, for instance, they need to be involved. They need to know what's happening. Otherwise, they've got this whole other stuff going on in their team that they don't appreciate. So we talk about that. We create a communications plan. Who are we going to communicate to? What are we going to say to them? Mm-hmm. How are we going to communicate to them? If it's a very big program, we should be doing workshops so people understand what's involved, how to give feedback. If this is not something people have done before, how do we help people to give effective feedback through a 360 process?
Yeah.
All of that, yeah. What the process is going to look like, what happens online, what do I need to do? And then the post feedback is very important. When do I get my report? Who sees my report? And who else sees my report apart from me? Does my manager see it? Does HR get a copy? All of those things. All that has to be prepared and communicated in advance. And also, importantly, do I get some support? So when I get my report, who do I talk to about it? Can I talk to, if I don't want to talk to my manager, who do I talk to? Is there someone I can get support from? Is there someone in HR I can get help from?
Couple of questions. Okay, go ahead.
On the performance review side, we do our 360s are used for some clients as performance review, but they are very, very bespoke. So they're very much around very specific management roles, and therefore, but a more general 360, we wouldn't use it. But where we build those systems specifically for performance review, then that's slightly different to the general. Just wanted to say that, and hope that's clear. Yeah.
If you're going to implement it, what's a reasonable timeline for you to, from drafting your purpose statement to being done the whole process? What's a reason?
Yeah.
Right.
Normally, I would say, and it depends obviously on what resources you have in the organization as well.
Or
Yeah, that's always tough. I mean, we do, just as an example, I'm sure other providers do the same. So we can run the whole thing, or we can set up the online and the client can run it in-house. But broadly, we're talking maybe a month to get the preparation in place, the content and all of that. And then 2 to 3 weeks to run the actual 360. 2 weeks is slightly too short. 4 weeks is too long. 3 weeks just gives people enough time. They may have been on vacation, for instance, right, and they come back and do it. And then that should be enough time to get enough feedback. So we're talking maybe a couple of months altogether, not for a normal program. Sometimes for big programs, it can be staggered over a longer period of time.
Okay.
And again, that's really around the needs of the organization.
Yeah. At the end of that, you also talked, or like the previous question, you also talked about who is going to talk to them about the results at the end. What do you recommend?
Ideally, it would be the line manager, the team leader, because they're in a position to really help that person to take their feedback forward. And they're also in a position to, the next day or the next week, say, hey, remember that feedback that we talked about? I've seen you doing that now. Well done. Because they're in a position to do that. And that's why I think the best person is that the line manager or the person, their boss. That's not always the case. Sometimes line managers or bosses don't have the skills necessarily, although they should. But sometimes, you don't have to be an expert, but having some basic coaching skills is really important. So listening, two-way conversation, asking questions is actually really important. So alternatively, some big organizations we work with actually have, they've developed some coaches. They have some coaches within the organization, which is great practice for the coaches, and it's cost effective. And those coaches are available to have those conversations. So that can be quite good as well.
We talked about this a little bit in the last episode, but how do we make sure that the right people are involved? And who are they?
Okay, so the right people, if we're going to do this right, are going to be the line manager. Also, my view is all of the people who report to that person. So if I'm the person getting feedback, all the people in my team that report to me should be asked. They may not all answer, but it's important that they are all asked. And the way to make sure that that happens is to have that as part of the process. So as part of the process, everyone, the line manager and all the direct reports, can be asked through the system in advance. Now, it could be that I have peers as well. So peers are useful providers of feedback because they have a different view of how I work. They might see things quite differently, how I communicate, how I share, all of those things. So that's always a useful input. It could be, you could also include people that I have informal working relationships with across the organization. So people that, could be just other colleagues. It could be people who provide support services. They can have quite an interesting input as well. So the key people should be asked by the organization.
Okay.
Yeah. Whereas it's also a good idea to then allow the individual to ask for more. Right. Because they might know people who can give them feedback that we don't know are there, have worked with. So give them the option. And if they have the option, that helps them to engage with it as well.
Yes.
Now, it's harder for them to say, well, nobody asked me. I don't know who these people are that are, what about so-and-so? We didn't ask them.
What do we do with the output?
In terms of The output, so individual output, so the individual report, the output will be top areas where there is agreement. So we can pick those up and we can talk about, great, these have been identified as strengths by quite a lot of people. So that's really good. How can you use those skills better? How can you make more of the skills that you're really good at? How can you build those into your daily job, more than you do now, if possible? How can you develop other people in those skills? If you're good at those things, how can you help other people to become good at those things as well?
Mm-hmm.
We also look at, let's look at some key themes that maybe need some extra development. So it may be that something around sharing information. Maybe, Jo, you don't always share information with your colleagues as much as they would like. Let's look at what this is about. Why do you think this, can you think of any examples of where you could have shared more information? Let's do that. Let's build that into what you're going to be doing in the next 3 months, for example.
Right.
So I think what's important is from that report, picking up the key themes and taking them forward into actionable change.
How do we make sure that both the individual and the organization benefit from this process?
I think, it's a great question. Well, I think that making sure the individual benefits comes from all the things we've talked about.
Yeah.
Careful design and preparation.
Yeah.
Is really important. And aligning the 360 to the values and the behaviors that the organization values.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we're asking people to do certain things differently, but the 360 is not measuring those, then there's a bit of a gap. We're not really helping them to focus on those areas. Mm-hmm. So that's most important, I think, is really carefully designing and planning. Mm-hmm. And then a good process in the middle. So a process that is easy and uncomplicated, just because people are very, very busy and they've got lots of things to do and they don't need extra complication in their life. So I think that's important in the middle bit. And then afterwards, what we've talked about, which is the follow-up, which is really, really important. So we can make sure that people get the absolute best value if we have a good follow-up process. And, sometimes we want to just get over the 360 and give people their feedback and it's done. But it's really worth having that follow-up and making sure it happens.
What pushback, what does typical sort of complaints pushback look like, and how do you address it?
Okay, so people who are, I think that at the leadership, they can push back because they don't really see or haven't understood the value of it. They might think, well, do we need another assessment, or do we need another tool? And it's a good pushback. Yeah, and that's why. It's very valid. But I think importantly, to identify the relationship of what the 360 is measuring with what the organization is trying to achieve, and also the ability of the data from the 360 to be used to measure overall organizational behavior. So I think we probably talked about it previously, but the data for individuals can be aggregated to data for particular parts of the organization, departments, regions, roles. So actually, if you look at that data, you can start to see some areas where there might be some critical gaps or critical issues as an organization that need to be looked at. Alternatively, you might see pockets of really great practice. Now, let's identify those areas of great practice and let's get those other areas doing the same thing. Yeah.
Sure.
So So I think often those people don't get it because they haven't really understood the value of that data. They don't really understand what it's for. And that's why it's really important to get them into the 360 process at the start. Actually go through it with them. And that's always a good one because individually they can experience it, and then as a team they can experience it and they get it. And that's a good way as well of saying to them, look, okay, let's do it with a senior team. And if it's really something that is valuable, that you find valuable, then that's fair enough. So that's a good way of dealing with it. And then for individuals, you're going to have people who are reluctant or afraid that they're going to get negative feedback.
Yeah.
And of course, that is possible. So again, there's something about explaining what it's for, how it's going to be used. And there's something about a culture of feedback as well in an organization. I wouldn't bring 360 into an organization with no culture of feedback at all. People have to understand what feedback is, even at a very basic level, and what it's for and what the intention of the feedback is.
How often do you run into those organizations that have no culture of feedback?
Not often.
Okay.
We more often run into organizations that have done 360 but not very well.
Okay.
Because they weren't ready. And it all went a bit bad because, people didn't know what was going on, and people felt vulnerable. People were worried about being caught, giving negative feedback, all of that. So we have more of that than organizations have absolutely no culture of feedback. But there is a relationship there. Many years ago, I had someone who said to me, we had feedback and nobody did it. Nobody gave us any feedback at all. They came to us after this had happened. And I said, well, what did you do? And they said, well, each of us just sent an email and said, give me feedback. So out of nowhere, they got an email that said, give this person feedback. They had no idea what it was for. So it was all a bit, what are we doing here? So some simple stuff like that is helpful.
All right. Final question. Where could someone learn more about implementing a 360 process?
Well, we have quite a few resources on our website. There's information on the Track 360 page about the platform and all of that. And there's a blog and resources that you can have a look at. So that's a good place to start. If you also want to ask me any questions on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn. There's quite a lot of material there as well. And you can just send me a message.
All right. Well, I'll put links to that in the show notes. Well, thanks, Jo. I'm left with a reflection that it's very important that we consider the outcomes and doing things well, and in particular communication, in ensuring that this maximizes the outcomes and the benefit for the employer. However, we have reached the end of this episode. Jo and I did an introductory episode on 360s, and the link to that is right there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.